Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Thank you all for coming. My name is Sharif, and I work for Baina Institute. Baina Institute is it's an Arabic and Quranic studies and educational and media and research institution. And so what our goal is basically to share an appreciation of the Quran, especially from a literary perspective, to people in easy language. So I work for the research department, and I also work for the publications department. And in publications, we've just finished writing our first book. I wrote this with my teacher, Ustad Numan Ali Khan. It's called Divine Speech: Exploring the Quran as Literature. I'll be talking a little bit about this book as we go on, and most of my presentation is taken in some way from this book. And during the breaks, you guys are free to check it out if you want. And I'll let you know how you can purchase it and everything. So I call this presentation the Quran, Coherence, Consistency, and Structure. And basically, I had a few topics in mind about the Quran. Basically, what are the most puzzling aspects of the Quran, especially to Western audiences when they're reading, for example, a translation of the Quran. And so I thought about this in my own experience studying the Quran. When I first started reading the Quran, what did I find the most difficult or the most puzzling about it? And it turns out, once I started researching these topics more in depth, these turned out to be some of the most interesting and dazzling aspects of the Quran. And so basically, there are a few different things. One is the fact that when you start reading the Quran, you'll notice that there are shifts in the narrative perspective. There are grammatical shifts. For example, first it will appear that it's God who is speaking. But then God will be referred to in the third person as He, or as God, as Allah. Or it'll be addressing a specific person in the audience. And then it will address a plural audience. Or it will be addressing one community, and then it will start addressing another community. And it'll talk in the past tense, and then it will talk in the present tense. And so this gives the impression to many readers that the Quran is very disorganized, and it's very jumbled. It's perspective of narrating. And the German Orientalist Theodor Noldeke, he said, Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, he said Muhammad is a mediocre stylist. This was his conclusion based on these shifts in narration. So is that the case? Of course, he believes that Muhammad was the author of the Quran, which is not what Muslims believe, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But is that the case that the Quran shows a mediocre or poor style because of that? Another aspect of Quran that is potentially very confusing for audiences at first is that when you study one of the chapters of the Quran or one of the surahs of the Quran, it seems that it's not devoted, in most cases, not devoted entirely to a single topic, but a single surah or a single quote-unquote chapter will address many different topics. And these topics might seem unrelated. And moreover, if you're familiar in literary terms, they call it stream of consciousness, where it's basically just presenting an author's thoughts in procession, in sequence. It seems kind of like that. It seems as if the Quran, its style of narration, the logic of it might not be clear at first. And so this gives some readers the impression that, again, the Quran is disorganized, and there's not a clear logical connection from one topic to another, or there's not clear coherence and unity within a single surah. And the third aspect, which I'll be addressing probably not in this presentation, but in the one a little bit later this afternoon, the stories in the Quran. Especially people of Western audience, of Western Judeo-Christian background, when they start reading the Quran, at first, they notice a lot of very familiar names and characters. The Quran makes a lot of references to biblical figures such as Adam, such as Noah, such as Abraham, Moses, Jesus, so on and so forth. It refers to them, and it narrates and retells and refers to their stories. But then if you look at these stories, oftentimes the Quran has what seems like a very peculiar way of narrating these stories. That, this isn't the version of the story I'm familiar with. Or, I know this character, but this story I've never heard before. This story, I don't recall hearing this story in my Bible classes or growing up as a child. And so that's something that is also perplexing. And moreover, there's the fact that the Quran narrates its stories not in a chronological fashion, like in the Bible, from the beginning of history to the biblical writer's own time period, but rather it narrates basically snippets from history or snippets from the lives of different prophets and biblical personalities and so on. And within a single surah, it might mention part of the story of one prophet. It might mention part of a story of another people in history. And so it's not narrated in a chronological sequence. And so this is another aspect that can be perplexing to readers. But what we're going to be exploring is that contrary to some of the first impressions of the Quran that a reader might get because of these things, when you actually study these a little more in depth, it actually shows that the Quran has a very profound logic and a very profound structure to it. And so that's why I call this presentation the Quran: Coherence, Consistency, and Structure. By the way, if you guys have any questions at all, as I'm speaking, feel free to raise your hand. And I want to try to make this interactive as well, not me just simply lecturing, but entertaining questions and discussions. So before we get into the literary stylistics and structure of the Quran, I just want to give a brief introduction to the Quran. How many non-Muslims are in the audience? So we have a few. Awesome. So that's why I prepared the first part of the presentation, just to give a general background in the Quran before we get into the specific literary features that we're talking about. So the Quran is the holy scripture of Islam, just as the Bible is the holy scripture of Judaism and Christianity. The Quran is the holy scripture of Islam. One difference between the Quran and the Bible is that Muslims regard the Quran as a word-for-word, basically spoken revelation, the actual spoken word of God, communicated to the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, through the angel Gabriel over a period of 23 years. How's this different from the Bible? Well, if you're reading the Bible, you'll notice that the Bible isn't just simply a single book, but the Bible is actually a collection of books over a long period of time in history, written by many different authors, and it includes many different genres. It includes narrative, history, poetry, and so on and so forth, laws. So in that sense, reading the Quran is a different experience. It's not as diverse in terms of its contents and perspectives. Within the biblical books, there's often many very differing perspectives because of its diversity in authorship. And Jews and Christians generally, for most of the Bible, they don't view it as being the directly spoken words of God, but rather they view it as having been written by human authors who were divinely inspired. There are some exceptions to that. For example, the Orthodox Jewish view is that most of the Torah was written by Moses, dictated to him by God. Some of the prophetic writings, the prophets present these writings as basically God's communications to them. But overall, the case with the Quran is different in that it presents itself not as a work authored by Muhammad, but rather as the words of God communicated to Muhammad, which he was then commissioned to share with people. And this was over a period of 23 years. So this was over a very short period of time, as opposed to many centuries, as we have in the case of the Bible. These 23 years are divided into two periods. The first 13 years in Mecca, from 610 to 622, Mecca was the birthplace of the Prophet Muhammad, in which he preached for the first 13 years of his ministry. And following, after many years of persecution and all sorts of adversities that he and his followers experienced, they made the hijrah, they made the migration to the city of Medina in the year 622, and that marks the Medinan period, and there were 10 more years in which the Quran was revealed during the Medinan period. And here's a map so that you can see. So obviously Mecca and Medina, they're both in Arabia. Medina is north of of Mecca, and both cities are south of Jerusalem. And they're on the coast, almost on the coast of the Red Sea in central Arabia. So the word Quran means recital or recitation. And that's very important because as soon as you understand that, you realize that the Quran isn't, before it's a book that you read, it's an oral performance. And so the Quran has, the sound qualities of the Quran are very important. That's not something that, unfortunately, you'll get in translation. The Quran, it's rhyme, it's rhythm, it's poetry, it's music, it's harmony. That's something that's very central to the very concept of Quran itself, that the Quran is something that is meant to be recited in the Arabic language. And obviously in any language, if you translate it from one language to another, you'll convey its meanings, but you're going to miss out on the beauty of the language. And that's all the more the case when you have a very poetic text. So the impact of the Quran derives not only from the meanings and contents of the message, but also in how they're presented from a literary and a rhetorical point of view. By rhetorical, I mean the persuasive and aesthetic and emotional impact that it has on the audience when it's being recited. And from this, Muslims traditionally regard the Quran as actually being a miracle of literature and rhetoric, which human beings are unable to match. This idea comes from the fact that the Quran, according to the Quran, every prophet and every messenger was sent to his people with a message of monotheism, trying to get them to worship one God and to live ethical lives based on that consciousness of God, and also understanding that there will be accountability before God. But these messengers, they weren't only sent with these messages, but they were also sent with miracles of different kinds, which were suited to the cultures and the times and the settings of their own people. And so, for example, Jesus, peace be upon him, he raised the dead to life, and he healed the blind and the leper. Or Moses, he turned a staff into a live snake, and there were the plagues, and so on and so forth. What was the miracle given to Muhammad? The miracle given to Muhammad from a Muslim point of view is the Quran itself. So those previous prophets before Muhammad, they were all sent to specific people for a certain time frame. And as a result, it would suffice if the message was separate from the miracle, that there were miracles that they performed showing that they were prophets, but also there was the message that they had. But if the Quran is meant to be for all times and all places, then there couldn't be miracles that could only be witnessed for a single generation, but the miracle had to be part and parcel of the message itself, so that people could examine it for generations and generations to come. And so the miracle of the Quran from the perspective of most Muslims, there's many aspects to it. It's the meanings of the Quran. It's things like prophecies in the Quran. There's all sorts of different aspects to it. But one of the most central of these is the literary and rhetorical miracle. The power of the Quran is primarily conveyed in its oral recitation with its exquisite language, style, rhythm, rhyme, and melody. But it can also be appreciated in the form of the written text. So the Quran, it first presents itself as an oral phenomenon, but then it also later on refers to itself as a kitab, as something that's written, that can be written and read. And as I stated, when you translate that, you lose some of the meanings of the Quran, but you also unfortunately lose a lot of its poetry and its music. So here I'll play a short, like 30-second clip of the Quran, and so that you'll get a sense of its rhyme and its rhythm and its melody.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعاديات ضبحا فالموريات قدحا فالمغيرات صبحا فأثرن به نقعا فوسطن به جمعا إن الإنسان لربه لكنود شهيد وإنه لحب الخير لشديد أفلا يعلم إذا بعثر ما في القبور وحصل ما في الصدور إن ربهم بهم يومئذ لخبير.
So as you can see from that, the Quran, when it's recited properly, it's something that's very, very beautiful to listen to. And that, once again, is something that you don't get from reading a translation of the text. So what are the main themes that the Quran focuses on? If you know the main themes, then that will be able to guide your reading. It'll make it a lot easier. So the Quran, I like to think of it as a formula that occurs over and over again in the Quran, the concept of Iman and Amal as-Salih, that there's faith and righteous deeds. So there are two aspects to it. One is that the Quran aims to transform your mental, transform your thinking, transform your perspective on the world. And that's encapsulated in the concept of faith. And on the other hand, it aims not to merely change your thinking, but also the way you act because of that thinking. So the first foundation that the Quran aims to establish is the concept of monotheism. That's the idea that there's a single God who created everything, who sustains and governs the world, who's all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good, all-merciful, but also just. He's also the most just, which means that he also will hold people accountable for their wrongdoings. And so this isn't a concept of God that you find, for example, in certain philosophies, such as in deism, where you have the idea of a God who he created the world, but then he left it to run on its own. That's very different from the Quranic concept. The Quranic concept of God is that of a being he's morally interested in his creation, and he takes a very active role in his governing of the creation. And with that, that inspires the concept of God consciousness or taqwa, that whatever I'm doing, God is aware of it, and God is merciful, but he will also he might also hold me to account. He's conscious of both the good deeds and the bad deeds that I do. The second main pillar of the Quran is the concept of risala, the message or the revelation. So this is the idea that God didn't leave humanity unguided, but rather he sent prophets and messengers to all times and all places with this same message, the same idea of worshiping this one God who created everything and who's the Lord and Master of everything and everyone. And as a result, people have an obligation both to God, to worship him alone, and also to the rest of creation, to act righteously and ethically. And finally, there's the concept of the afterlife. It's the idea that if there is such a being, if there's a God who's merciful and he's just, then he's not going to leave all the wrongs that happen in the world, he's not going to leave those wrongs without righting them. That there is going to be accountability. Human beings were created for this test and given free will and given the ability to exercise that free will, but that there are strings attached to that human beings will be held accountable in the next life, on the day of judgment, the day of resurrection, and that people will be rewarded with paradise or punished with hell, respectively, according to their deeds. So as I mentioned, the concept of God in the Quran, it's the concept of the creator of the heavens, and these are different names of God in the Quran, translations of these names. Creator of the heavens and the earth, the Lord of all peoples, the eternal, the all-knowing, the all-powerful, the most merciful, the just, the one or the unique, and different formulas in the Quran emphasize the perfection of God, such as all praise is due to God, or to him is the highest similitude, or that there is nothing like him, or exalted is God above all imperfection. The Christian theologian Saint Anselm, he gave a definition of God with which most believers would agree. He said that if you want to just, what is God in a single line? God is the most perfect conceivable being. He's the being who has the most perfect attributes that are logically possible. So monotheism, as I said, is not just an idea that people have. It's not just a belief system, but it has practical implications. It has the idea that we're all accountable to God as His servants. And so the concept of worship in the Quran, as the Quran says, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونِ. God says in the Quran, I have not created humans and jinn or spirit creatures except to worship me. But the concept of worship in the Quran isn't simply that of prayer and ritual, but rather it's how I act day to day. It imbues all of my life with meaning, and it affects how I interact with the rest of God's creation. I'm going to sort of go through this part quickly. I'll probably skip some parts of it so that we get to the main presentation. But the concept of signs in the Quran is very important. Signs or ayat. So from the Quran's perspective, this concept of God isn't something that prophets had to come and teach people, something that they didn't already know. But rather, it's a concept that's already inherent in human nature. And there are actually some scientific studies, some very recent ones, that show that there's actually a part of the brain, or there's a part of human psychology that's very much geared towards belief in God. And so this is something that the Quran claims is part of human nature, to believe in such a being. But human beings, although that's part of our psychology, it's something that we can forget over time. And so prophets came with different signs of God in order to not teach people anew, but actually cause them to recall this intrinsic consciousness of God. And these signs are things like signs of God in nature, signs of God in the universe, the creation of the heavens and the earth. These are things that when you observe them and reflect on them, they trigger that instinctual knowledge of God that's in the human being. Here's a translation of one ayah, one verse of the Quran pertaining to this topic. In the creation of the heavens and the earth, and the alternation of the night and the day, and the ships that sail through the sea, with that which benefits people, and what God sends down of water from the sky, giving life thereby to the earth, after its lifelessness, and dispersing on it all kinds of beasts, and in the changing of the winds and clouds that run their appointed courses between the heavens and the earth, there are signs for people who reason. So the Quran very much emphasizes observing nature, and that's actually an act of worship for believers. So the concept of message is quite fundamental to this presentation. It's the idea that all prophets were sent with this message to teach people about the oneness of God and to correct the different wrongs that exist individually and in society. And the Quran contains many stories of biblical prophets, and it affirms previous revelations, such as the Torah given to Moses and the Gospel given to Jesus, or the Psalms of David, the different revelations that we find, for example, in the Bible. It affirms these revelations, but it's important to note that it affirms them in their original forms. So the Quran doesn't necessarily maintain that these revelations, as they exist today, are completely intact or completely reflect the teachings of those prophets, but rather that they have suffered over time through transmission and in their recording, that they have suffered some degree of human tampering. And so that's why the Quran had to come and restore the original message of those prophets. And finally, the Quran focuses very much on the afterlife. The idea that God's mercy and justice will be realized most fully in the afterlife. And so the Quran talks about the end of times. It gives a lot of imagery about the end of times and the day of resurrection and the judgment and paradise and hell. And this imagery it's meant to inspire consciousness of the moral consequences of our deeds. So now we get to the main core of the presentation. Some of the Now that we've understood the main themes of the Quran, what are some of the literary features of the Quran that at first appear puzzling to audiences? Well, there's the question of who is the speaker, and why does the Quran frequently shift its mode of address? There's also the question of the coherence and structure of the Quran. Why do its chapters or surahs seem to address many different topics so often at the same time? Why does they seem to randomly shift from one topic to another? Why do the surahs not appear to have a clear structure or organization? And finally, the stories of the Quran, which we'll cover in the later presentation. Why do the Quran stories of biblical characters often differ from those that are in the Bible? So now we come to the topic of these grammatical shifts that I referred to, is that make the Quran at first appear very disorganized and disjointed. So the first speaker, one of the narrative perspectives that you'll notice when reading the Quran is that God Himself is speaking to the audience. And God is referred to, He's referred to in the first person as I. For example, in one of the verses I mentioned, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونِ. I did not create jinn and mankind, spirit creatures and mankind, except to worship me. So naturally enough, God refers to Himself as I or me or my in the Quran. But one thing that's very puzzling is God also, more frequently, God refers to Himself as we, or us, or our. Now this is very strange, because didn't we say that one of the core messages of the Quran is monotheism, that God is one? How do you explain this? So this is actually it's a rhetorical or grammatical device. It even exists in many languages, but it exists even in the English language. This is called the royal we or the majestic we. Linguists refer to it this way. So for example, a king might say, not I issue a decree, but he'll say we issue a decree. But the king's only referring to himself. But by saying we, it impresses on the audience a sense of grandness, a sense of grandeur, that simply using I would not convey. So it's not a plurality of God Himself. It doesn't imply that that there's more than one God, or that God exists in many different persons, but rather this is purely a grammatical or literary device. God is also referred to in the third person, however. For example, He's referred to as God or Allah. He's referred to as Rabbuka, your Lord, your Master. He's referred to as He or Him or His. So why are there these three different perspectives? And do they occur randomly, or is there actually some kind of pattern in them? So recent studies by, for example, Neil Robinson or Dr. Abdul Halim, they've studied this topic in depth, and this is actually something that was known to Muslim scholars. Muslim scholars also wrote about this subject, and they regarded it as part of the miraculous nature of the Quran, is the fact that these pronouns don't occur randomly, but actually there's a subtext to every single one of them. So when God refers to Himself as we said that this is the royal we, or the majestic plural. And so it follows from this actually that whenever God uses we, for example, we sent down the rain, or we created the heavens and the earth, He's highlighting His majesty. And this occurs in contexts in which God's greatness and His power and His providence and provision in creation are being emphasized. For example, the Quran says, "From the earth we created you, and to it we will return you." and from it we will bring you forth another time. So if you think about this verse, it's emphasizing God's power here and God's ability to create and to give life and cause death, and also to raise people from the dead once again. Another verse is, we have certainly revealed to you verses that are clear proofs. So here God's authority is being emphasized, that the verses of Quran were revealed by God as clear proofs. And so hence God's authority is being highlighted through the use of we. And those cities, we destroyed them when they wronged, and we made for their destruction an appointed time. So once again, it's emphasizing God's might and God's power. So you see this occurs in many very different kinds of contexts. Thanks. It occurs in contexts where God's mercy and to the creation is being emphasized, when God's punishment sometimes or retribution is being emphasized, and in other contexts as well. But what all of those contexts share in common is that there's an emphasis on God's power and authority and majesty. And now that you know this, as you learn this, it will really enrich your reading of the Quran. You'll say, hey, God uses the term we here, or God uses I here, or God uses he here. What's the reason for that? What's the connection with the context here? Now, the third person, this is the second most common in the Quran. God is referred to in the third person as being, you could say, as not being the speaker, but as being a more distant person. The third person is used in contexts where the primary aim is the delivery of the Quran's central message, or monotheism. How does that work? In these cases, there's been linguistic studies of this by, for example, Roman Jacobson, about these different kinds of, the use of different modes of speech. So when a speaker refers to himself in the third person, in the Quran at least, it gets you to picture or think about the speaker independent of the speech that you're listening to. So for example, the audience is influenced to think of God's attributes or actions as an objective reality, independent of the communication of the speaker. So in these cases, because the Quran is referring to audiences, it's speaking to audiences who include both believers and disbelievers, who contested whether the Quran is the words of God or not. So in some cases, the Quran wants you to forget that controversy and just simply internalize the idea. Just internalize the idea that, for example, it is He who created for you all of that which is on the earth. Moreover, He directed His attention to the heavens and made them 7 heavens, and it is He who is knowing of all things. So it could have said we or I here, but rather, now the Quran is trying to get you to think of God in detached from the Quran itself, detached from the speech itself, thinking about it in the third person. Another example, truly God is one God. Exalted is He above having a son. To Him belongs whatever is in the heavens and the earth, and God is sufficient as a trustee. So you see that these are very often statements about monotheism, statements about God's nature. Another example, God, there is no deity but Him, in the famous Ayatul Kursi, the verse of the throne. The living, the maintainer of existence. Sleep and drowsiness do not overtake Him. To Him belongs whatever is in the heavens and whatever is on the earth. Yeah.
I have a question. So do you know how you said earlier that the Quran's like the direct spoken word of God?
Yep.
So in these verses, He would be talking in the third person.
Right. So exactly. So God is still the speaker, but He's trying to get you to think about what He's saying, to basically visualize or picture it in an abstract sense. Another example, Qul huwallahu ahad. Say, He is God, the One. Allahu samad, God, the eternal source of refuge. Lam yalid wa lam yulad. He does not beget, nor is he begotten. وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٌ. And there's nothing comparable to him. So very often these are statements of monotheism, which the believers can actually discharge in different situations. So for example, if God had said we or I in these verses, well, it's harder to quote in different situations. But these offer, basically, you could think of them as short creeds or hymns of God that believers can very easily quote in their conversation. So now we're in a position to see, why does the Quran sometimes shift from one of these modes of discourse to another, even within a single passage? So let's take this example. We are sufficient for you, speaking to Muhammad, we are sufficient for you against the mockers who make gods alongside God. So it goes from we to God. They will soon know. We already know that your chest is constricted by what they say. So exalt your Lord. Now it's in the second person. So exalt your Lord with praise and be among the prostrators, and worship your Lord until the certainty of death comes to you. So you see these shifts. But now if you understand the subtext of each of these pronouns, you'll see that these are actually very calculated, very intentional. So first of all, as is the normal case in the Quran, God comforts His messenger directly in the first person, using the majestic plural to highlight His grandness and bounty. That whatever trials you're going through, whatever suffering you're going through, don't forget that we are sufficient for you. You have the one who's all-powerful, who contains the treasures on the earth. You have His support. And so the psychological impact that has is it makes you remember that whatever you're going through and whatever losses you're experiencing, you have the one who's the all-powerful, the all-merciful, that He's protecting you and He's supporting you. Then the mockers are depicted as worshipping deities besides God. And so God was referred to in the third person by His name Allah, which literally means, the name Allah literally means, it's a contraction of Al-Ilah. It means the God, stressing His exclusive divinity. So when it says, we are sufficient for you against the mockers who make partners alongside God. So now it's the fact that they're making partners along with the one who's the one and only God that's being emphasized. Hence the switch to the third person. They will soon know. Now it comes back to we. We already know that your chest is constricted by what they say. So God is once again emphasizing His power and His majesty, that He has full knowledge of what's going on, even in your heart. So exalt your Lord with praise. So now when the Prophet is given instructions to worship God, God is mentioned as your Lord, emphasizing His relationship to the messenger, His relationship to the Prophet, that He is your Lord and He's your master and He's your creator and sustainer. So exalt your Lord with praise and be amongst the prostrators and worship your Lord until the certainty of death comes to you. So do you understand? Are you starting to understand the mechanics of this, how it works, and how when the audience has an understanding of this, it can actually have very powerful psychological effects. Another example. This translation of this verse, it starts off, it is He who sends down water from the sky. So you're made to think about God in the third person as an objective, independent entity, and as a distant entity, because you're picturing the fact that God, you can't literally picture God, but you're imagining the fact that God He's above the heavens and He's sending down the rain. So this is a distant kind of concept. But then all of a sudden it changes to we. With it we produce the shoots of each plant, then bring greenery from it. And from that we bring out the grains, one riding on the other in close packed rows. From the date palms come clusters of low-hanging dates, and there are gardens of vines, olives, and pomegranates, alike yet different. Watch their fruits as they grow and ripen. And all of this, there are signs for those who are willing to believe. So when God was speaking about sending water from the sky, he used he, the more distant pronoun. But then when he's referring to growing vegetation on the earth, he uses we, which is um, which is which is emphasizing that he's the one who's speaking directly to you. It's closer to your own vantage point. Now, I didn't talk about why does God, although God uses the first person, he usually uses we instead of I. So, but in certain special cases, God uses I. Why is that? First of all, the pronoun I or me or myself, this comes in contexts in which, first of all, quotations from the creation story, in which God is speaking to the characters directly without any angels or without any prophets as the intermediaries. So God is directly speaking to Adam, he's directly speaking to the angels, he's directly speaking to Satan without any and also to the prospective human race, to all of humanity. He's speaking to them directly without any intermediary messenger. For example, وَإِذْ قَالَ رَبُّكَ لِلْمَلَائِكَةِ, when your Lord said to the angels, إِنِّي جَاعِلٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ خَلِيفَةً, truly I am going to create a vicegerent or a representative or a successor on the earth, referring to Adam, referring to the human race. So he speaks of himself in the singular first person as I, since he's speaking to the angels. And later he says, Inni a'lamu ma la ta'lamun. Indeed, I know what you do not know. The second kind of context in which I occurs is quotations and scenes from Judgment Day, in which once again there's no intermediary between God and his creatures. He's speaking to them directly. So at the creation and also at the end of the world during the day of judgment, God is speaking to people directly, and hence you find the use of I. The third kind of situation in which this occurs is divine promises and threats in stories of past messengers and their people. For example, God says to one of the destroyed nations, taste my punishments and my warnings. So in this case, the use of my has this very direct, threatening quality. That it's God himself who's speaking to you in a very direct manner. And number 4, key moments in salvation history. Key moments in salvation history. God uses I. For example, when Abraham was tried by his Lord with commands and he fulfilled them, then God said, Inni ja'ilaka linnasi imama. I am going to make you a leader for mankind. This is a very important time in the history of the human race, in terms of the salvation of the human race. So God uses the singular pronoun. And then he says, my covenant does not include, when Abraham asks him, will my offspring have the same privilege? God says, my covenant will not include the wrongdoers. So since he's speaking to Abraham at this very fundamental point in history, he uses the singular pronoun. Number 5, the use of I occurs in contexts in which God's monotheism, God's oneness, needs to be safeguarded. For example, we'll see examples of that very shortly. But actually, one example from the verse I quoted, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونِ. I did not create jinn and mankind except to worship me. God uses the singular here so that no one gets the idea that there's more than one God who needs to be worshipped. But rather, he uses the singular to remove any kind of misconception about that. And finally, number 6, this is one of the most beautiful, intimate communication to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, or to the believers, or to the audience. God uses I sometimes to strike a note of intimacy between himself and the audience. So now we'll see some examples where the Quran shifts from using I to using we, and the effect that this has. For example, in the beginning of Surah Al-Qiyamah, فَلَا أُقْسِمُ بالنفس اللوامة أيحسب الإنسان ألن نجمع عظاما. Does man think that we will not gather his bones? So first he swears by the self-reproaching soul. He says, I swear, striking this, making you aware that that it's that God Himself is speaking as a speaker. Then he says, does man think that we will not gather his bones? So now it's God's power being emphasized through the use of we, that God has the power to raise people from the dead. And yes, indeed, we are able to even shape a person's fingertips, even restore, after a person has died, the fingertips of a person. So every single person has their own unique fingerprints. God's saying, we have the power even to restore those exactly. So by using we, once again, it's highlighting His power. How about a shift from I to He? God says, O my servants or my slaves who have transgressed against themselves. So by using my, here it actually does two things. One is that it strikes a note of intimacy. And the other is that the word slaves or servants comes from this ibad. It comes from the same root as ibadah or worship. So the word slave or servant also has a connection with the idea of a worshipper. So by using the singular, it once again safeguards God's monotheism, that there's only one being here who deserves to be worshipped. Do not despair of God's mercy. Do not despair of Allah's mercy. So now what's happening is, you're getting to think about it as an independent thought, and one which you can frequently discharge in different situations. For example, someone is in a state of grief or hopelessness. You can say to that person, or that person can say to themselves, do not despair of God's mercy. Indeed, God forgives all sins. Indeed, He is the forgiving, the merciful. So at the beginning, it's emphasizing that God is speaking directly and intimately, and then after that, it's emphasizing God, the objective facts about God. That not to despair of His mercy, that He forgives all sins, and that He is the forgiving, the merciful. Then a shift from He to I. An example here, O soul at peace, Ya ayyatuhan nafsul mutma'inna, irji'i ila rabbika, return to your Lord. Return to your Lord, pleased with Him and pleasing to Him. Radiyatan mardiya. Wadkhuli fi ibadi, fadkhuli fi ibadi, wadkhuli jannati. And enter among my slaves and enter my garden. So here, first God He doesn't say return to me, but He says return to your Lord, emphasizing the relationship between this soul who's passed away and its master. And then He says, enter among my servants, enter among my slaves or my servants, and enter my garden, speaking this on this very intimate tone directly to this soul that has passed away. Some other grammatical shifts are shifts in the audience that's being spoken to. For example, the Quran shifts from saying you all to they, the second person plural to the third person plural. For example, God says to the Israelites, we shaded you with clouds and sent down on you manna and quail. Eat of the good things that we have provided you. So these are in the second person, talking directly to the children of Israel. But then all of a sudden it switches and it says, and they did not wrong us, but rather they were wronging themselves. So what's happening here is, first the Israelites are being spoken to directly. God is reminding them of His favors to them. But then it's as if He's turning His face away from them in disappointment. And then He's addressing the new elected religious community, the Muslims, saying, they did not wrong us, but they were wronging themselves. So this shift has the effect of showing God's disappointment with them. A shift from, now the opposite shift, from the third person plural they to the second person plural you all. Upon them will be green garments of silk and gold embroidery. They will be adorned with bracelets of silver, and their Lord will give them a pure drink. Speaking about the people of paradise. So what it's doing is it's getting the audience to imagine these people and imagine the blessings that are being bestowed on them. But then it switches to the first person, or to the second person plural. Indeed, this for you is a reward, and your effort has been appreciated. So first the audience is thinking about these people as separate people, these people in this very high station, but all of a sudden then God turns to the audience saying, actually, you are potentially those people. And God is saying that, God, this is a reward for you. So once again, has this very beautiful, comforting, psychological effect. Then a shift from you in the singular to you all in the plural. God says to the prophet, turn your face, speaking to him as an individual, turn your face to the sacred mosque. But then he says, wherever you, in the plural, wherever you are, turn your faces towards it. So first he gives the instruction to the messenger in the singular, but then he gives the instruction to all of his followers in the plural. There are also shifts in tense from past to present and present to past. Just to give an example of where this occurs, this often occurs in scenes where God is speaking about the apocalypse or the day of judgment, or God is speaking about things in the future. He's speaking about the day of judgment. Sometimes he'll be speaking about it in the present, the future tense. In Arabic, present and future are combined, and then he'll switch to the past tense, as if saying that although these events lie in the future for you, as far as God is concerned, they've already happened. So it has this effect of emphasizing the certainty of these events. It says they're as good as having already happened. So that concludes the part here on the grammatical shifts.